So today we're going to kick it off with Tyson Garrett, who will be talking about shifting threat models from static to dynamic.
Thank you. So firstly, I'd like to thank all of you for coming in on a Sunday when most of us would be sleeping in and resting. So thank you, and also thanks for the organisers for putting this event together. Given the fact that it's sold out, I think it's a testament to the need for these types of conferences as well. So hopefully we see more of them in the future. So this talk is really going to be about the need to shift from looking at threat models in cloud environments as a static exercise to one of how we need to be thinking about this as a continual process we need to be doing. And I'm going to be giving some reasons about why, looking at cloud environments, and also how you can reduce the impact of these changes in your environment. You can't necessarily stop them, but you can reduce the impact of them. And then how you can look at it from a triage exercise as well, of mitigating that impact, what the workflows you could look at implementing within your environment to make it a more optimal process for yourselves, because obviously this is going to involve additional work at some level for people. But the whole idea about that is, like everything we're doing in security here, is to increase the security within our environments. So a little bit about myself first, and I'll keep this brief because there's not that much about me. I'm the CTO at Trust on Cloud. What we do at Trust on Cloud is we do threat modeling of cloud services as a service for customers, where we do threat model cloud environments, but in a consumable, machine-readable format. Prior to that, I was working at AWS, and I worked officially in professional services, but pretty much was seconded to work with the service teams in AWS, working with the security hub mostly and config teams on defining what controls customers we could implement as detective or preventative controls in customers' environments as well. So why do we need to look at cloud environments from a continual threat modeling perspective? And I like to get some data here versus just a person with an opinion. And it's really the rate of change. And I'm looking at APIs as a measure of that rate of change as well. For the people in the room, there are some seats at the front here. I don't bite, you can get closer up to me. And it's this rate of change, right? And I say here it's the best method. It's not conclusive. As I'll mention later on, issues with just looking at APIs. But for this data point, it's a good outline. Roughly, it's about between 20 and 30% per year. There'll either be a rate of change in these APIs, and I'm looking at that from there's a new API, or there's a modification to an existing API. So there may be new properties allowed within there, which may introduce slightly new functionality, which may change how you look at the risk or the threats involved in giving someone access to that API. The stats here aren't saying AWS is slow and Azure is fast. I think it's more of it's an interesting stat, but it's not within the maturity of some of the services, maybe more feature-rich in some of the AWS stuff where Azure's catching up, and so therefore there's greater APIs there. It also talks about different cloud providers will look at APIs in different ways. Some of them may be more obsessed with adding properties versus just adding new APIs and an existing function as well. But you can look at this, the impact of that means from a customer's perspective, I'd look at it, your applications, they may be having, the APIs they're using may be changing, or they may have access to a 25% rate of change every year. And so that's thinking about your applications is, well, when I threat model it, it could do this. Now it can do 25% more potentially as well, depending on how you're using permissioning and other things within your cloud environment. So how you can be impacted, obviously APIs is the primary method here. I look at APIs because this is how we interact with the cloud environments at a fundamental level. If you're using an SDK, if you're using the portal, CLI, PowerShell, whatever you may be doing, at the end of the day, these are all API calls at the foundational layer. So it's a really good way of thinking about what we need to threat model the APIs, because that's the source of truth, not what options may exist in the CLI command or whatever. So you can be impacted that way in terms of these changes, but permissions are another way, right? So hands up here, who's using managed roles in a customer's cloud environments, right? Exactly. So some of the vendors will say, use managed roles. This is the most secure way of consuming our cloud environment. I disagree. I'd say it's a more secure way than giving someone root access. So yes, it's a step in the right direction, but it's not necessarily dependent on the environment, right? If this is a high sensitive environment, my recommendation would be to use the managed roles as a starting block of, well, this is what the cloud provider thinks for a use case. If you're using the Azure storage service, storage contributor might be a good starting block. But then figure out your principle of least privilege in what you actually need for an application. And then the next question I'm going to have is, who uses stars somewhere if you're not using managed policies? Probably no one's putting their hands up. Okay, if you're using managed roles, you're using stars, okay? So, that's the thing. Look, the cloud providers are like, I don't know, we'll just do a /star/read, and there we go. So you're going to be impacted by when you've got stars in policies as well. And then finally, the other way you can be impacted by cloud changes is when they change their defaults. Okay, so all of a sudden, the default action, if you don't specify a particular property, you might see it as a create something in the portal or a CLI command where you're not specifying an output. You may be impacted if they change their defaults. Now, thankfully, because the cloud providers are security conscious and are trying to move things forward, they're going to be looking at increasing the security. So they might say, okay, by default now, your bucket will be encrypted. Okay, which is awesome, thumbs up. You've now got confidentiality environment. You may have an availability issue though if you didn't want the bucket to be encrypted and it's going to break an application. So my recommendation here is you want to think about defaults could potentially hurt you as well. So is the change good or bad? Okay, it's not all changes are bad. It's not all changes are good. So examples of where the cloud providers are introducing features, this is part of that 25% benchmark increase here, is when they're introducing controls for your existing threats. So Amazon introduced S3 block public access a couple of years ago. The risk about, do I have a bucket which is public in my account, in my organisation? I'm nervous. Everyone's doing the press every couple of weeks. There's another exposed bucket. Amazon would say, well, buckets by default are private. You have to do something to make them public, which is correct, but turns out lots of people accidentally make them public. So having that feature was a really cool feature, but you need to know about it. If you don't know about this new feature, then you're not going to potentially be able to implement this new control for an existing threat you may be having if you're using S3 buckets. Azure Storage as an example, they've got to introduce a feature last year. If you gave someone the ability to copy within a storage account, that allowed you to copy, or by default, that allows you to copy to any other storage account, which for the security conscious people in the room is a straightaway data exfil concern. So they introduced a feature which prevents the copy scope to be only in your tenant or in your account. So once again, awesome new control for an existing threat you've got. So this is the way of their new features help you, which is they're going to talk about it, but you need to be aware of it. And then you need to analyse that and think about, well, how does this actually help me with my existing threats? So how can I actually add this on as a control versus, well, I threat modeled the stuff and I'm now not going to add new controls on. Or potentially it may have prevented you doing a certain data classification level because the controls weren't present. You were relying on a detective log analysis control, which is going to be responsive in nature versus a preventative control around that. And finally, GCP added the ability to do additional login options in their Vertex AI for training jobs. So once again, this is an example of new control for an existing threat, but you need to be aware of them as well. So the not so good examples, and we need to look at these as cloud providers aren't intentionally giving us bad APIs or permissions within our environments. They're not saying, hey, let's make it easier for people to attack our environment, but all new features, most features can be abused in some way. And our job as security and threat modelers is to think about how could this be used in a malicious function, or fashion, I should say, versus a not so much. And so like AWS introduced a cool new way of getting your credentials for your EMR cluster, which I'm presuming was done so you didn't have to statically put it in code. You could do this as a part of a process, automated, so people weren't seeing the credentials, etc., which is great. But if you previously had controls around how they could get these credentials, now there's an API which will just give it to them. And if you're using those stars or those managed roles, hey, guess what? Someone may now have access to something that it previously didn't have access to. Azure introduced a SFTP feature last year. Awesome. There's another way of getting access, great in legacy environments as well, etc. However, it was required you to create local users. So basically non-federated. So now you've got an identity management lifecycle set of challenges present in your environment, which you may not have been controlling. If you don't know about these things, you're not going to be implementing the controls to do it. So once again, another hassle there. And another example, slightly different here, was GCP and all the cloud providers. They'll be having their cloud native databases, but they'll often have traditional Postgres, Microsoft SQL, Oracle database services as well, where they'll be managing this as a solution for you. They introduced new database extensions for their databases, which made it easier for outbound access to occur from the database in an automated way. Now, this wasn't something like an API thing. This was like a new feature, which was automatically going to get rolled out to all existing databases as well. So all of a sudden, the functionality of something has now changed, and we now need to then figure out how is that now going to impact us. So hopefully I've convinced you, or I've convinced myself at least, that you should be doing this as a continual basis. We need to then think about how can you be aware, okay? It's not looking necessarily at the what's new page on a service. We need to think about how can we be aware in an automated code fashion, because ideally we're not looking at these things, we're looking at we've written code to look at these things for us, to make it a lot easier for us. So I've got a list of stuff here from the cloud providers. I've also got some third-party sites here as well. Because of the nature of how things can change, it's not just going to be one thing. It's going to be multiple areas you need to look at. The real big ones you want to focus on are the APIs and the permissions. You want to look at both because some services the APIs may not be exposed to you, but so it's more point and click type of activities, but they will introduce new permissions for you. So you want to think about, okay, these permissions, sometimes there'll be a one-to-one match with an API, sometimes you've just got the permission. So you really want to be looking at both of these constructs to make sure you're staying across things. And then some services like Azure, you've then got Microsoft Graph on top of it. So it's not just the Azure stuff, Graph, which is the identity foundation for Azure, you've got to be staying across that part as well. So be aware of these other parts around your environment, not just your cloud service specifically as well. Once I can say that word. Okay. And this finally, sorry, at the bottom there's some awesome third-party sites. Some of them are our ones, some of them are other third parties here, which are available like as RSS feeds. So this is once again, like if you're looking at a repo every day to see if there's a change, there may well be a problem. You want to have code be doing this for you. And we'll talk about some ways of doing that later on. So now we've got a whole bunch more work to do. I like to think of myself as efficient. Some people might call it lazy, but how can we minimise the impact of what we have to do here as well I think is really important because there's a lot to do and there's a lot for us to do regardless of this challenge. And so how can we make ourselves more efficient here? So the ways I look at it are, firstly, know your environment. Okay, if you don't know your environment, that's a fundamental problem. This just makes this more visible as an issue, okay? So you need to have, like some people would call it the boring stuff, asset and configuration management. So if you don't have, and this is more than necessarily, this may be more than just a source code repo of like, oh, that's my asset management database. You need to know, also things like, what types of data classifications are used in these resource types. Sometimes you can do this as tagging, sometimes you can't. So you need to be aware of these gaps there. And you also want to have an understanding of your organisational structure. So you want to understand those races within your environment, like who is responsible for implementing a new log monitoring control? Who is responsible for implementing a new preventative control in my environment? Who's responsible for implementing a runbook change? So then once you've realised, okay, we need to do this in our environment now as well, you want to be able to rapidly do it and have everyone who's responsible for those aspects know that they're the ones responsible as well. And then it's about reducing your impact, right? So number one, I would say don't use managed roles. Okay, if you're not using managed roles, now you're in control of what permissions you're giving out in your environment versus the cloud provider automatically updating them, or either by virtue of updating the roles themselves or by virtue of there being a star or asterisk in that policy as well. So I would argue don't use maintenance roles. Don't use managed roles. Maintenance windows are important. That GCP example I gave before around them installing a new database extension, if you had maintenance windows in place, you'd be defining when that change occurred in your environment versus sometime in the next 2 weeks this change will occur. It may have already occurred in your environment. So if you're using maintenance windows, you can't necessarily stop the change, but at least you know when it's going to occur, and at least you know by what point you may need to implement controls around that change, instead of just going, oh, well, it happened a week ago and hopefully it didn't cause a problem for us. Thirdly, don't rely on defaults, right? If you're relying on defaults, you're relying on that default never changing. And as we've seen, cloud providers will occasionally, in the interests of security, change their defaults. But as I mentioned, those default changes may make you secure, but may break functionality in your environment. So I would say for every property you can configure on a resource, configure it. Even if it's to a disabled state or something, you want to be very intentional about your configuration aspects as well. And then this default aspect, if you're doing CLIs or if you're using point and click type of solutions in your environment, i.e. the cloud provider's portal, I would probably go to an infrastructure as code aspect, because this is where you actually can declare what you want those properties to be. This goes to number 3, those consumable artifacts. You want to have whatever solution you're using here, you want to have examples in your environment or templatized ways in your environment of doing this. So everyone else in your organisation can be using your consumable for a resource versus them all deciding which one they can use. If you know what you're defining and someone in the organisation is defining that, instead of having to change 50 configurations, you're changing 1. So once again, it's that. And number 4, just to reiterate number 2, principle of least privilege. So don't use managed roles, don't use stars in your policies. It's there twice because it's really important. Like, identity is the firewall of the cloud. How do you maintain velocity and improve security? So triage, right? And this is like things you can think about, which we'll talk about on the model on the next slide. How do you triage the deluge here? So if you know your environment, you can ask the question of, is this going to impact a resource that we're using? So if you're not using the resource, like i.e., say you're using Amazon SageMaker, you're not using SageMaker notebooks, you don't need to worry about this new feature of SageMaker notebooks. I would say, however, you want to be able to be sure of that you're not using SageMaker notebooks. So I would recommend customers have detective controls to validate that they're not using something. So I'd have a control in place to detect if somehow someone is using a SageMaker notebook. So you don't want to just assume that you're not doing something. You want to validate that you're not using a particular function of a service, etc. as well. Customers often forget that feature. They may be looking at, we're not using these regions, which is awesome from a regulatory compliance standpoint, but you need to be aware of you need to validate that you're not using particular resource types as well. And you can do that in a variety of ways. Then you also want to look at if anyone is using, if you are using a resource, can someone actually execute this new feature? So what's your permissions look like? Are they going to be able to execute this new feature because it's a change to something, or do I need to give them permissions? And these are all areas where you can think about off-ramping. I don't have to worry about this threat. If they can execute it, what would the threat be? So this is the point where actually you need to do threat modelling. All the steps before here is how can I not have to do threat modelling? Okay, so it's a good way of thinking about it. That goes back to my sort of, be lazy or be efficient approach here. And then once you figure out the threat, well, what's the sensitivity of the environment? So this talks about we're going from the threat modelling exercise to that control implementation prioritization stage. How quickly do I need to jump onto this? Is it urgent? Couldn't be a backlog item. But this is, and that's where threat modelling can really help us determine what's the criticality of the threat, what's the level of difficulty in executing this threat, what other permissions may they need to have, what controls may I already have which mitigate it. But then that data classification, that sensitivity, then helps drive forward what the urgency is. So I drop a sort of a flow chart of these two previous slides here, as well as things that we recommend customers have or consider having in their environment to help give them the ability to do this process. Okay, so we've got on the, trying to think which way I'm looking and which way you're looking. On the right left-hand side here, we've got the tech changes, where we're looking really at that automated code here of detecting changes in environment. I gave you the links a couple of pages ago of how can I detect a change in the cloud provider environment. These are all code, typically JSON format change sort of feeds, so you can very much manipulate that as code. You then need to ask the question, am I using the resource? Okay. If you've got an asset database, which we recommend, you can call that asset database and go, am I using this type of resource that this API is impacting? If I am, if I'm not, no impact, don't need to worry about it. If I am, we then look at a permission lookup. Do I have a permission to use this API? Who's got permission to use this API? If no one's got permissions, that's great. If someone does, then I need to start worrying a bit more. Okay, and you need two parts here. You need a database of the permissions you've got within your environment, and then you also need to have like this mapping of the APIs to permissions as well. Because if you don't know that, then you're going to have a challenge. If you've got the permission present, once again, this is where you threat model the change. Okay, you then go off and implement the controls, and then you've done for that atomic change. Obviously, there's going to be more changes in your environment, but this is sort of the process here, and a lot of this is all automated stuff, not so much manual processes. Obviously, you may wish to validate some of this logic here of like the system has automatically said, no, we don't need to worry about these controls or these threats, but there's a lot of like the low-hanging fruit here is completed automatically for you. You're not sitting there having to go through a list of changes every day, for which we don't have time. Now, for the clever people in the room, you've probably been thinking, okay, I might say clever, the more cloud mature people in the room may say, well, that's great, Tyson, but there's a bunch of challenges here, which I readily admit there are. I see them as opportunities, though, for people to really dive deep into these things, because I think there's vast opportunity for people to look at these problems. So firstly, the permission inventory. Okay, knowing what permissions a entity has in an environment is really, really hard. Okay, you think about the JSON of a permission policy for a cloud environment. You're going to have like some of them will have action, some of them will have not action, some of them will have conditions. So it's not just do I do a string match, it's complex. Amazon have got a thing called, or AWS have got a thing called Zelkova, which is automated reasoning with people from Oxford University, like pure math formal PhDs to try and prove if can this entity run this thing. So, because it is a complex process. But I think if you don't have an understanding of what permissions entities have in your environment, you're going to have a challenge. The second part is this API to permission mapping challenge, where you can map about automatically 60%. I'm using Azure as an example here, of their permissions to APIs. That's 60%. Like there's a big gap of what you can't automatically map. And then automatic mapping may not always be accurate. They may release a permission where you think it matches a path, but often, or not often, but sometimes it's a different permission they actually implemented. Some cloud providers don't publish the permission API mapping. So this is like another challenge. And the final one here is undocumented APIs. So there was some research done earlier this year where they scraped the portal and they could find all these cloud provider APIs which were not published, which you may have though had ability to execute. So if you don't know about an API, then it may not be in the SDK, so it's not a simple thing to do, but anyone who can construct an API can then basically execute it as well with the permissions. And the other final part here is API changes. Sometimes you'll see this in the portals. They'll be releasing, they may publish their APIs, but the portal may be using a version of the API which is not published. So therefore there's additional functionality there which we don't know the full nature of, yet we have the permissions to execute if we knew how to do so. So there's like another challenge there in doing this. I'd argue there are inherent challenges though in using cloud environments, but we need to know the limitations of what we may be aware of as well. So I think we've got about 4 or 5 minutes left. I wanted to open it up for questions for folks. I think someone's got a mic at the back of the room. There we go. Feel free to talk up.
Got a question?
I have like a few questions.
Yeah, sure.
So the inventory that you mentioned in one of the slides, the third party,
Yep.
is that maintained by a community or this is?
Well, no, this is like, so there are some of these things, those permissions, there are some people who have published some things. Ian Mackay, who's published one on his GitHub repo recently. So Ian Mackay's stuff's under that GCP APIs, under that IAM data set. He's published some of these permissions. He's doing it in an automated fashion though, and that's where I mentioned those limitations of it. The cloud providers, and I've spoken to people within the cloud providers, and this isn't where I used to work, it's other ones, there's no centralized database internally of what the permissions are, which is scary, and in so many levels, but unfortunately not. The challenge of community, also other stuff is, no one's paying the community people to do this work, and I know there's the ability to pay by GitHub and everything, and it's hard. Like when we do the work, we have to test every REST API manually for no permissions, and then what the permission is required to execute it successfully, and it's, you can maybe do 10, if you're good, 10, 15 an hour, and some of these services have got like 1,000 APIs. So it's there's a little bit there, but it's not fully featured.
And just one more question on
Yep,
the
sure.
next slide where you had the asset inventory.
Yep.
That's the area of passion for me.
Yep. Good to hear.
Like where do you put like a data flows within your organization, because that essentially is also part of your asset.
Yeah,
inventory.
correct. Yeah. And so like I look at things like I look at like stuff like Draw.io is great because it's XML. So for those who didn't know, so if you're doing your Draw.ios correctly, you can actually infer a bunch of stuff at a code level from that. If you're doing it, obviously you've got to be doing it very much correctly and in a structured fashion. Yeah, 100%. Like that could be part of it, but I'd say that data flow thing is more like of a control. That's part of a control inventory, I'd argue, versus a data at rest inventory thing as well. But it's a good point. Yeah, data flows, because that may then add context to the thread execution. Is this just within a VPC, or is it? And I can only execute it if I've got access to my virtual network in the cloud, or is it a publicly exposed resource? Part of you could get from the asset database, but then the ancillary controls on top, like network security groups, etc., that would appear in your data flow as a control thing as well. Any other questions? Will your slides be available? Yes, the slides will be available on the...
I believe so.
Yeah, if not,
I'll have to double check. We
pin
can,
me,
we can
I'll
clarify
make them.
that.
Yeah.
Anyone else have a question?
So I'm going to be outside on one of the tables, so you can hunt me down then if you'd like and ask me a question. The name's on the deck.
I actually have one question for you.
Yeah, sure.
So you mentioned about detective controls in terms of a service that may not be being used.
Correct, yep.
Any recommendations or suggestions on
Yeah.
how to go about adding those?
Yeah.
And yeah, because cloud providers are always providing new services.
Yeah, correct. So look, so there's obviously at the meta service level, a lot of the cloud providers will provide like AWS have organizational SCPs, for example, where you can like allow deny list stuff. Other services like Microsoft will have there's a permission to enable the service in your account, for example. So you can do things like that to stop it, but to your point about detecting it, you've got their log monitoring solutions as well, which can do it. But I would personally, I prefer do that, but the Swiss cheese effect of controls, have a detective control which is looking for that resource type. So like a function or whatever, which is like list the things I don't think I've got in my environment, or if the cloud provider's got like an asset thing which automatically detects it, that's great as well, as a control point to detect it. So if your login control fails, then this other detective control will detect it as well.
All right, sounds
Cool.
good. Everyone give a warm round of applause to Tyson Garrett. Thank you very much. All right, we'll have the next talk coming up in about 9 minutes from now.